Adam, have you... There we go. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be running our second webinar at QuantSpark, and it's a real pleasure to invite everyone attending today. The purpose of today is to discuss the reality of implementing AI and using AI and the broader data science techniques to provide value to the broader economy and value creation, of course, primarily to private equity-backed businesses. So thank you very much for everyone's time. Without further ado, let's crack on. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And the intent of this session is to share our perspective at QuantSpark on the transformative potential of generative AI, provide some clear guidelines on how we believe AI can be successfully deployed in a business context. So very quick introduction to who we are at QuantSpark, if you're not familiar. We focus on identifying and automating high-value complex processes, and we bring to bear a number of skills to do this. We focus on strategy and transformation skills and combining those with data science, analytics, and of course, building custom data products. And we believe that this combination of skills are more important now than ever before, because many of the problems that we face in terms of automating or optimizing complex processes require an extraordinary blend and variety of skills. What we do at QuantSpark is focus on supporting businesses in the end-to-end transformation journey. Long gone are the days when it was possible just to focus on one particular tool or technology. Often what's required is a more holistic view to understand what the business strategy is, what the key processes are, and what the most appropriate way of using analytics technologies might be. So it's an increasingly complicated and complex thing, and requires a number of elements that we think are really important. The first actually is nothing to do with data. In fact, quite a lot of what we find with successful implementations of analytics is that the mindset is really important. And the mindset, primarily in my experience, that leads to success is thinking about the overall kind of strategy of the business, how the business even thinks about data. If you have a management team that is reliant on gut feel or instinct or intuition, and if you have processes in the business that aren't data-driven, it's going to be quite difficult in many senses to have a successful transformation project unless those foundations have already been set. The second part of this is strategy. And in my experience, having a clear articulation of strategy, ideally something like OKRs, objectives, key results, that tends to result in much more effective implementation. So wherever we can, we'll work with our clients to help define that strategy and ensure that analytics is an integral part of how the business hopes to grow and succeed. And depending on the industry, depending on the business, generative AI might pose an existential threat, or perhaps it might provide opportunity to improve productivity and help the business focus on whatever provides its strategic advantage. And the third element of this is kind of counterintuitive in the sense that if the business has the right mindset, has a clear articulation of the strategy, it then needs a way to identify opportunities quickly and frankly just get on with it. So bias to action is also very important. If we wait to see what generative AI will be like in a few years' time, we run the risk that competitors will be using this technology more successfully than us. Now, in the software industry, this is a particularly significant threat. Arguably, generative AI is most a threat to those businesses and business models that have already been digitalized, which is perhaps quite unfortunate for them. But nevertheless, with the right mindset and a good strategy and a bias to action, we believe that any company will be able to not only survive, but thrive in this environment where generative AI is providing so much disruptive opportunity. So moving on to the next slide. In the UK, last week, we had the announcement of the UK's AI strategy. which in my view is a really successful articulation of the opportunity for the AI. Previously, under the previous government, a lot of the conversation about AI was focused on safety concerns. And certainly these concerns are warranted. It's very important that we think through how very large AI systems will be providing recommendations and so on. But generally, most experts would suggest that the type of artificial intelligence that might cause concerns is many years, if not decades away still. So focusing on the now of what can we do with this technology, I think it's also critical to reference some statistics. So good news is that actually a very large minority of UK businesses are already using AI tooling in some sense or another. The problem is that articulation of precisely how AI is going to be used is still a bit of a challenge. And we think there are a number of reasons for this. And we wanted to share some of these thoughts, as well as some practical recommendations about what to do in your own business. So moving on from this, there is, of course, the hidden risk of falling behind. And what we know is that historically there's been quite a big focus on AI safety, especially from the UK government. And this is changing quite significantly. And with the new AI action plan, there's going to be much more focus on building data centers in the UK and promoting this idea of data sovereignty. And that can only be a good thing. The real threat, in our view, is business competitors adopting AI faster. And in a sense, the challenge here is that many businesses, software businesses as well, face an incumbent disadvantage as a result of needing to change processes pretty quickly, and as a result of kind of being tied into business models that perhaps are no longer entirely relevant. One challenge, of course, of generative AI for software businesses is that use scales and cost scales accordingly, which kind of disrupts the entire business model of SaaS if the amount of use increases your cost base on a prorated basis. But more generally, we believe that business must embrace AI, and AI meaning analytics, machine learning, and generative AI, if the businesses are to remain competitive. But there are real challenges with this because of that incumbent disadvantage. That provides opportunities for new businesses, I think, to significantly disrupt the incumbent players. But it does present I think, quite a big headache for investors in existing businesses, where there are legacy systems, processes, and mindsets that will need to be adjusted in order to make the most of these opportunities. So moving on from this, the summary of the new strategy that was outlined by the Prime Minister this week focuses on accelerating the adoption of AI in public services whilst ensuring safety standards, and focusing on this idea of growth as a principle. This can only be a good thing, but in my view, is only part of the puzzle. Moving on from this, then, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, does this go far enough? So the focus has primarily been on data centers, and those of us who have worked in telecommunications will know that data centers, of course, there are only really two competitive advantages for data centers. One is the latency, so how quick is it to, how near is it to the user? And then there's the cost. And both of those are determined by geography, of course. So the cost of data centers is a function of where they're located and also the electricity prices. So it's a laudable aim to focus on data centers and on infrastructure, but what does that mean for business? And in general, how should we respond to this strategy? So next slide then. In terms of the evolving landscape, it's good that we are moving away from fear to opportunity. It's good that this focus on economic growth and job creation innovation, but this is all a bit abstract. Another point that needs to be stressed is that, in a sense, in public discourse, there's a lot of conversation about innovation. And the point I want to put across here is that, in many senses, the large language models that have been released, those foundation models are already phenomenally sophisticated. They're already disruptive enough, I think, to present a huge challenge for the economy and an opportunity for entrepreneurial businesses. So the innovation, in a sense, kind of has already been done. These large language models are now so sophisticated that you can pretty much do anything you want using a combination of large language models. My view is that the implementation is what we should be focusing on as a business community and less on innovation. And sometimes there is confusion between innovation and implementation. Having a Nobel laureate for computer science and large language models, okay, great. But what does that mean for business and what does that mean for society? Certainly, Accenture and quite a few consultancies have put it out there that they're probably making more revenue from implementation than OpenAI is in monetizing the core models. So it's the implementation that's critical here, but it also probably the hardest thing to do, which may explain why there's not a lot of conversation about how do we implement these technologies and how do we incentivize businesses and management teams to be brave and to make the most of this amazing technology. So moving on from this, in terms of snapping into action, we'd argue that innovation has got to turn into practical applications. And what we already have in terms of the large language models are already incredibly powerful, if only we know how to deploy them. And we've created an environment in which a business can thrive as a result of this. What we also know, of course, is that big revolutionary changes in technology always take a long time to be implemented. And where electricity is concerned, for example, and the conversion from steam power, and I think this is a really quite good analogy, actually the adoption of electricity took quite a long time. And there's sort of two major productivity puzzles in the history of modern technology. The first is electrification of factories, and the second is the adoption of the simple computer. Both of these major technological advantages took many decades to flow through into the economy. And even then, it wasn't really necessarily that easy to calculate the ROI from the productivity gains. And quite simply put, those manufacturers using steam power were slow to use electricity for two reasons. One, capital expenditure. If they've invested a lot in steam engines, well, you're not going to ditch those for electric motors overnight. And then secondly, presumably there's a mindset shift that was required, which took some time. So quite simply, what was needed was for the managers of factories using steam power to die. That's what was required for these technologies, for electricity to be adopted. And I think we have to hope that we're able to implement the benefits of generative AI a lot faster than that in the economy, but it's going to be really painful. And I think it behoves the investor community to try and drive this forward, recognizing that previous technological gains actually have been kind of pretty hard won and not quite as straightforward as we might imagine. So moving on from this, artificial intelligence, or specifically generative AI, provides a wealth of opportunity. There is also a kind of philosophical divide here between those who believe that generative AI is there to eliminate boring things versus actually doing the hardest things. Personally, I use a number of large language models for several hours a day as a sort of an assistant in writing proposals, in analyzing documents, in coming up with new ideas, and so on. So actually, personally, I use generative AI to provide leverage for me with some of the most difficult things I do. I don't personally use generative AI to do repetitive tasks, but that clearly is an important use case. So given this, what do we do about it? How do we use this in practice? The impact on the workplace, we'd argue, is focused, of course, on automating repetitive tasks, but it also can be used to focus on kind of high-value activities. And as a productivity enhancer, generative AI almost is presenting the first wave of innovation, but we also need to think about how we can automate the most complex things. An example of this is a tool that we've developed over the past year, working with an airline services and logistics business, where we built a system that ingests contracts at scale and uses a variety of models, 16 models, some of which are large language models, some are more traditional machine learning and statistics, to calculate revenue leakage. And in a sense, actually, this is an example of automating dozens of quite simple steps that a human being could do, but in combination actually presents a complex adaptive system. And what we've built for this particular client has been tremendously successful in terms of building a system that would otherwise have required 20 or 30 people to do full time. And the client just didn't have the budget to do this. And as a result, there was a real risk that we were missing revenue by reconciling contracts and invoices. So this is a great example of being pretty imaginative in the use of generative AI. And also was a great example of breaking through AI hesitation. What we recommend where generative AI projects are concerned is to scope out a pretty targeted use case, something that's small enough that can be done in 4 to 6 weeks, but is big enough to impress people with its ability to do something useful. So striking the right balance there is very important, as are the kind of classic change management things that you might expect for any transformation program. And this is the point more generally, that for generative AI to be effective, we've got to consider this as a transformation initiative. And that means thinking through how this technology is perceived by colleagues and ensuring that AI is not considered to be the villain necessarily, actually focusing on the core processes that are so important and being really concrete. So we recommend starting with pilot programs or prototype even to prove the ROI or to demonstrate how useful this can be, and then surround that investing in a training culture so that your colleagues begin to trust these sorts of processes. Because actually, I would argue that the biggest value that we can derive from generative AI is actually not automating the repetitive tasks, the really simple repetitive tasks, but using generative AI in a more agentive way to handle an entire complex process, because it's often those complex processes that are at the heart of how a business makes money and its strategic advantage. So I'd like to kind of reframe this to think, with your business or organization, what is it that gives you strategic advantage? And of that, how can you leverage this amazing technology? Don't just think about generative AI doing the mundane things, because getting better at the mundane things isn't really going to provide you strategic advantage. And it's probably difficult to craft a good business case if you're just automating the boring things. Although if you're a very large business, of course, and there's a lot of admin in that business, that may well add up to a significant ROI. But generally speaking, that tends to be a weak basis for a business case in my experience. So moving on from this, in terms of AI requirements, we often share this pyramid. And the key thing here is right at the bottom of this pyramid, people and culture. Does your business or organization have the right people, the right culture to think about decision-making and processes in the right way? And how best to support the organization in the transformation so that all the technologies on top of that work properly. So going back to what I was saying initially, in my experience, it's about that mindset. It's about the articulation of the strategy, and it's about the bias to action. And if these things aren't in place, you're likely going to struggle from any effort to deploy analytics and AI. But it might be the case that piloting the right AI initiative might encourage people to be a bit more open-minded about the adoption of these technologies. The challenge ultimately is if your business is unable to adapt to the changing landscape in terms of the technology, someone else will compete. And this is the case, for example, with call centers. Many analog call centers are likely to be completely disrupted by AI-first equivalents. And this goes back to what I was saying before about the incumbent disadvantage. It makes perfect sense if you've invested millions of dollars in your own systems and processes, you're not going to want to rip all that out and start all over again. But going back to the analogy of steam engines and electric motors, do you want to be the manufacturer that has refused to use electric motors and has just been replaced by a new generation of companies? And the question, therefore, is what does creative destruction look like in our economy, given the huge capabilities of existing generative AI tooling? Of course, we don't really know what's around the corner with generative AI. The capabilities are likely to increase exponentially. But certainly, given existing capabilities, I think many businesses are right to be concerned that competitors might use AI in a way to compete with them successfully. So moving on from this, in terms of generative AI, we'd also stress that GenAI can support every single layer of this pyramid. So in a sense, would be a bit of a category error to think of generative AI necessarily as only a thing in itself. Actually, generative AI can support every one of these layers of the traditional analytics pyramid. Of course, because generative AI is quite good at human language, is even better at computer language. So the ability for generative AI to write programs that then can do other things is really mind-blowing. And I'd recommend that anyone using Claude Anthropic, which is a competitor to ChatGPT, sign up to Claude, use a version of the model called Sonnet 3.5, and then ask Claude to write a program, simple program. It might be, Hello World, or it could be Tetris, or it could be, noughts and crosses or something. If you tell it to write that very simple toy app, it will do it, and it will then open up the application for you, so you can play around with it. It's pretty wild. But the point is that generative AI is commonly considered merely as a way of processing or generating content, whereas actually we should think of it as an augmentation of all the existing technologies. And we can get generative AI now to create software, to orchestrate other tools, and to run other systems. And that's called being agentive. And in that sense, generative AI can support, for example, data engineering. The future of data engineering will largely be generative AI. So it is quite imaginable that in 6 months or 12 months' time, you'll have an AI that figures out how to connect tables together. You have an AI system that can build data cubes. Really is astonishing what's around the corner here. So we'd encourage everyone to think quite laterally about the opportunities that generative AI is providing, especially when it's able to write code. So moving on from this, what I would argue as well is that there's a slight misdirection at the moment in terms of focus. So small businesses and large businesses, so startups tend to get a lot of focus by the policy community, certainly in the UK, and very large enterprise do as well. But actually a relatively small proportion of businesses overall fit into either of these categories. And I would argue that there's a Goldilocks zone right in the middle here, with medium-sized businesses having the greatest potential for adoption of generative AI. Goldilocks in the sense that they're big enough to have revenue, clear processes, professional management team, but it's small enough to adapt to these sorts of changes. So the disruptive opportunity, in a sense, I would argue, comes from the medium-sized businesses who are able to leverage generative AI to compete with the larger enterprises and able to innovate faster as a result of that as well than the smaller ones. So where private equity is concerned, perhaps paradoxically, it's the smaller portfolio companies that might have, in the long run, the greatest strategic advantage by deploying this. In the opposite sense, I think this provides a massive challenge for larger enterprises who've already invested a huge sum of money in legacy IT systems. How to adapt to that is, I would imagine, going to be one of the bigger challenges for the next 5 years for many larger enterprises. So moving on from this, in terms of the AI Playbook, we'd argue that there are a number of kind of key takeaway points here. So the first is to focus on process and identify what you might want to automate. So whilst I was fairly negative, I suppose, about the business case for automating repetitive processes, you obviously just want to do that. But the bigger picture is about the high-value complex processes that are fundamental to how your business makes money. In terms of how you go about this, I'd always suggest starting with a small scale implementation to prove the ROI, to build trust and confidence, to show that it's possible. And in the background, upskill employees about what's possible and what's not possible using AI, and what the dependencies might be. But then also focus on ensuring that whatever you're doing has a clear business case, with the outcomes being monitored, and ensuring that actually you're focusing on delivering value based on your understanding of the key processes. So moving on from that, that's enough of me talking and explaining what we do at QuantSpark and our sorts of approaches. It's a real pleasure to have such a great group of attendees, and I'm very keen to have a discussion now. Any questions anyone might have about implementation of generative AI in your business. So with that, we'll open up the Q&A. Okay, great. So one question. What do you think the AI landscape in the UK will look like this time next year? Well, the first part of this, I would say, is that I think it depends how we define AI. And I've used AI quite loosely in this webinar, kind of quite deliberately. So traditionally, AI is not really meant very much, if I'm honest with you. Largely, we've been talking about analytics, machine learning, and statistics. I think we're certainly at QuantSpark more confident in talking about AI now because it's sort of kind of useful, and generative AI has really changed things. In terms of the AI landscape in the UK, if I'm understanding this question correctly, I would say what I would expect is there to be an abundance of software available that leverages AI in all sorts of ways. So I would expect there to be dozens of new startups popping up, focusing on automating some of these key processes. And the first wave of this is likely to be the individual productivity. So email, extracting to-do lists from emails, responding to emails, summarizing meetings. I mean, largely that's kind of already matured as a market. I'd also expect a number of other use cases, like something called RAG, retrieval augmented generation. So summarizing documents. Again, I would expect that to become commoditized quite quickly. So I would expect there to be rapid developments in the market. To be honest with you, I'd probably advise most businesses to invest like half an FTE or more in just thinking about what solutions are coming to market. How might we use these? How can we reevaluate the tools that we were considering using 6 months ago? And then I would expect there to be much more focus on increasingly complex processes. But sort of, who knows? I think it's such a volatile and exciting and frothy space. Who really knows what advances are going to be made? But certainly I would advocate for much more time being spent on looking out to see what the large language models and their capabilities can offer, and then the secondary tools that have been built on top of these, because it really is mind-blowing what the rate of progress is. Even tools that we built 6 months ago, we now have to we've now thought about quite differently and have rebuilt based on even better generative AI. We would say that it's much better to get stuck in and to start using this technology than just standing back. A few clients we've had have decided to just stand aside and just wait to see what's going to happen. I would say that the extent of change across pretty much every industry is so great that we can't afford to just be bystanders in this, and we've got to get stuck in. The good thing about a lot of this, though, is that building software now is cheaper than ever before. So actually getting stuck in and building a pilot, building a proof of concept is pretty straightforward and low risk, actually, compared to even a year ago. So second question here, and thank you very much for sharing these. They're great questions. What use cases would you use AI for as a test pilot? So I think it very much depends on the organization and the psychology of the organization, and how open-minded your colleagues might be. Because I think the success to piloting AI is all about how it's framed. So is it to make a colleague's life a lot easier by automating really boring parts of their job so they can focus on more creative elements for that. Okay, great. If that's the case, there will be specific use cases that will make sense for that situation. Or is it, there's a really complex process, no one really kind of got a hang of it, it's a little bit messy, quite error prone, that's what we want to focus on. So I can't really provide a kind of general answer to what use cases would be most effective. I think it's all about the context of your organization. What's its mindset? What's its strategy? And how open-minded are colleagues to innovation and implementing new solutions? Because if you're working in an organization that has quite old processes and old systems and is quite, I suppose, defensive, you may want to select use cases that are slightly easier to deploy. But ultimately, this has to come down to the psychology of that change, because what you don't want is the first use case to be a failure. So the more you can think about how you frame that use case, the better. And actually, the funny thing is, developing the tool is often the easy bit. Finding the right thing to focus on first is usually the hardest part of it. Next question about data centers. So how viable do you think the development of data centers is in the UK based on the recent announcement from the UK government? So I would argue that data center development is extremely expensive. The biggest problem actually is electricity costs. So again, I would say, what's the purpose of these data centers? Is it sort of data sovereignty and having the capacity to train new foundation models here in the UK? If so, then the question has to be about the affordability of electricity, because I would find it highly unlikely that major developers of large language models would invest in the UK data center market when electricity prices are so high. So another question here, which is a great one. What are the most common organizational hurdles you see clients face in shifting from innovation paralysis to implementation success? How do or should they best address them? Well, I think the key thing here is to think of these initiatives as change programs, as transformation programs, and map out the pain points and the psychology and all of the things that may lead to success before you focus on the nuts and bolts of how you develop the tool. So there's a kind of a bit of a paradox here in our experience, at least in that the success of an initiative really has very little to do with what's actually built. It's all about how it's been framed. So what I would say is that those people with change management and transformation skills will really be in the ascendancy, because if we're to leverage this technology, I would argue we need to think of it as a transformational technology, and therefore the key success factors here are all about those soft skills and about trying to land the initiative in the right way. So the organizational hurdles, I think, would be about the culture, how open-minded, how defensive are colleagues, how excited are they for the opportunities to improve their own productivity. And then also, I would say, there are the data foundations. If your business or organization just doesn't really have a data foundation, that's going to be a bit of a problem. Generative AI might help in terms of data cleansing and improving data quality, but it won't solve all of that. And fundamentally, I think if an organization doesn't think about decision making through data, then you've got to kind of fix that first, because if your organization kind of operates on gut feel, that's probably the biggest problem to address first, which is why I really love OKRs, objectives and key results, because an organization, and there are very few of these actually, I think, that have OKRs in place, they tend to be better suited for driving change, because then there's alignment about what the organization is doing. But OKRs are relatively rare beasts, I think. Another question here, what's my perspective on the political influence on AI? Well, for those of you who know me will know that I also run a not-for-profit called Tech Against Terrorism, which works to detect terrorist activity online. And as part of that, we look at content moderation and various sensitivities about internet platforms and AI chatbots as well. And through that, I think the concern that we'd have there is that chatbots in particular are political by nature. They take positions on things, they make value judgments. And I'm sure we've all asked ChatGPT for its view on Donald Trump or Joe Biden and seen the results. In many senses, the chatbots, the way they've been built, is that they're kind of eager to provide answers to anything. Now, in terms of the bias of these models, one major challenge at present, I would argue, is that there's very limited visibility of kind of political bias of many of these chatbots. There are a few initiatives, a few in the US, a few in Europe, looking at measuring political bias of chatbots, but studying that is a significant consideration. But for most business cases, I think any political bias of AI chatbots is probably irrelevant. But ensuring that the large language models focus on solving the most complex problems and not being lazy is actually really important, because some of these models will sometimes try and do as little as they can get away with, which sounds like it's anthropomorphizing. But when using large language models, you need to be very careful to ensure that the outputs are constrained, because otherwise the large language models might seek a path of least resistance in terms of giving you an answer. Next question, how do you manage regression in AI models training? The main blocker for us at the moment is that the differences between a human and AI is that most of the time a human will progress, but we've seen incredible regression in AI models outcomes, which can cost thousands to retrain or debug. So I think focusing on kind of optimization problems. So firstly, generative AI, large language models, tend to be not really offer anything where, let's say, linear regression is concerned. What I would say is that often the success of ensemble models, in my experience, is actually determined by how you construct the system. So the case study that we went through just then in terms of the airline services model, actually there were 16 models all working together, workers really, to do separate parts of that process. But crucially, there is reinforcement learning. So without knowing much detail about your implementation or the problem that you're looking to solve, I would argue that you want to build a system that reinforces the right behavior. And instead of thinking of it being purely human or purely machine learning, as this sounds like it is, I'd want to ensure that there are enough humans in the loop to ensure that the reinforcement is working correctly, so that you're not just doing a big regression and then looking at it and then reviewing it later on, because I agree that could be extremely costly in terms of having to rerun training of models. So I'd want to ask about, what are the quality control checks in that process? What does reinforcement look like? And are there ways of sampling this so you don't have to retrain the entire data set if the data changes? Feel free to reach out if you'd like kind of more detailed thoughts based on the specifics of the problem that you're facing. So I think that brings us to the end of the questions that have been posed. Really appreciate everyone who joined. I hope this has been useful. Please feel free to reach out if you have any more questions or would like to discuss any specifics of implementations that you're involved with. If nothing else, we'd love to kind of share our thoughts and act as a sounding board for any projects that you're working on. So with that, thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you soon. Bye-bye.